Welcome, everyone. My name is Amit Doshi. I'm a librarian at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. We're so thrilled that you're spending some time with us this afternoon to discuss research metrics, and we have a wonderful presentation coming up for you. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today. It's Dr. Diana Hicks, professor in the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech, specializing in metrics for science and technology policy. Dr. Hicks was the first author on the Leiden Manifesto for Research Metrics, which was published in Nature and has been translated into 25 languages. It won the 2016 Simon Award from the European Association for the Study of Science and Technology for the collaborative promotion of public interaction with science and technology. Professor Hicks' work has informed policymakers in the US, Europe, Japan. He's also advised the OECD, Flanders, the Czech Republic, and Sweden on national research evaluation systems. Dr. Hicks has chaired the School of Public Policy for 10 years and currently co-chairs the International Atlanta Conference on Science and Innovation Policy, and was also an editor of Research Evaluation from 2015 to 2019. Dr. Hicks has taught at the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley, Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, and worked at NISTEP in Tokyo. She earned her PhD and master's degree from the University of Sussex. In 2018, she was elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science for, quote, distinguished contributions to the evaluation of national and international research and development enterprises, and for outstanding leadership in science and technology policy education. It gives me very great pleasure to welcome my friend, colleague, and mentor, Professor Diana Hicks, to give this talk on Leiden Manifesto for Research Metrics. Before we begin, I just want to note that we are taking your Q&A, your questions, and we'll have time for a robust conversation at the end of Professor Hicks's remarks. Dr. Hicks, thanks again, and take it away.
Well, thank you, Amit, and thank you very much for the chance to present today. As you said, I'm going to be talking about the Leiden Manifesto, which was an academic paper, ultimately, but the experience that we've had with it has ranged far beyond that. And so today I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm first going to introduce the context that the paper appeared in, came out of, really, the whole initiative grew out of, set our scene. Then I'm going to explain the paper with the help of a small video, and I'm going to then look at the reception that the work has had and what evidence we've gathered about its use. So to start, the thing to realize is that we need to look at this in an international context. In the years leading up to the work on the manifesto, many countries had implemented national evaluation schemes. And a lot of these relied on metrics. In this picture, the clear yellow bars are countries that relied on metrics in their schemes. And so with so much going on, not everybody was an expert. A lot of dubious practices were proliferating along with these schemes. In addition, the world had changed because, of course, of the advent of the internet and the advent of additional databases of papers from which you can do analyses of science metrics. And people piled in and doing different indices. The H-index took off. Of course, people began tweeting, then people began counting tweets. We had the altmetrics come online. So these things changed the context in which we did metrics. And at the same time, people were becoming more and more obsessed with metrics. In particular, people were becoming very obsessed with the impact factor, which is a number for a journal produced by the Web of Science database, and it's available to libraries, university libraries that have a subscription to that database, and people were using it as a shortcut for evaluating others' work, trading, impact factors as tokens of how good a paper would be. And the obsession with it was growing in the journal community. This graph shows the numbers of papers mentioning impact factor in the title per 100,000 papers and how that grew over the years, largely in editorials, because journals would, when the new impact factor list would come out, journals would say, oh, our impact factor went up. Pretty much everybody says it was going up because science was growing. And also there was research being done on the impact factor. So in 2012, publishers got together and said, wait a minute, whoa, they did what was called the DORA Declaration, calling for a halt to equating the journal impact factor with the quality of research, because there's a lot of problems with doing that. And we can see from this graph that things started to turn around then, that call for stopping some of this bad practice did have an impact. But we are still dealing with metrics overload, just from counting papers and citations. Now using an H index, the impact factor, downloads, tweets, and all these different, you could now count. Used to be just the CD-ROM days, you could just about get a country count out. Now you can count down to individuals. So much going on, and a lot of people getting involved who hadn't necessarily specialized in using these metrics and developing them and understanding their strengths and weaknesses and how they should be put together. So my co-authors and I, other people, four of the people in the scientometric community, three of them from Leiden University and one from Valencia in Spain, decided that something needed to be done and that a public statement of principles for research metrics would be valuable. And we thought that should be a statement, not in a scientometrics journal to people who already knew it, but in a journal that reached all of science, because we wanted to have a broad impact, to give scientists a tool to go back against administrators who were trying to implement bad practice on them, and to say, look, this is the standards you should be operating by. What you're trying to do here violates those standards, so you need to improve it. That was our goal with this, and by getting it into Nature as a commentary, as you'll see, we think we achieved it. So we'll have a little look. I'll explain the manifesto and what it involved, or what it prescribes, which I should say, it wasn't new. What we didn't make a lot of stuff up here. We pulled best practices and distilled them from the scientometrics literature, from the consensus about how metrics should be used in research evaluation. So it wasn't new material, it was just presenting it in a way that it would reach the broader scientific world. So I'll now go to the video, which will explain our 10 principles. That is the short version of a paper that really isn't that long overall. So these are the 10 principles again, very straightforward. And so we got this out there in, what was it, 2015, and and then things started to happen. First thing that happened was people were interested in translating the manifesto into other languages. And this happened because while academics, especially in this area, work in English, the administrators and the people in government departments who were in charge of evaluation tended not to be so facile in English, and the researchers wanted their administrators and bureaucrats to have access to this document. So people volunteered to translate it, and we started a website, and we posted these translations along with the video. And they keep coming in, the latest being translation into Bulgarian. So we're up to 25 languages now. So wherever you are in the world, you will likely have a version of the manifesto in your language, which is quite satisfying. And as Amit mentioned, we were honored with the award for outreach and public understanding from the Professional Association in Europe for Science Studies. That was a wonderful thing to receive, and it was because we'd done the video and we'd had the translation. So we had this outreach operation going, and it was having a broader impact that was becoming visible. And as I said, we weren't the only ones in this area. I've mentioned already the San Francisco Declaration of Research Assessment by the publishers, focusing in on the impact factor. And then subsequent to our paper, there was a report by the UK government entitled The Metrics Tide, which also had a big influence. So we are often quoted together with these others. And in fact, 3 of the authors on the paper from Leiden have developed a short course on responsible metrics in evaluation based on both the manifesto, the metrics type, and also DORA, and also involving people involved with DORA as lecturers. So they're engaged in training based on the manifesto. We've also been able to track a little bit of the government influence. We do know that these governments have referenced the manifesto in some of their procedures and policies. In Brazil, the Agricultural Research Corporation, Embrapa, has used the manifesto to help them expand their vision for their evaluation of their 46 research centers. In Panama, they introduced guidelines for the evaluation of the postgraduate program using the Leiden Manifesto principles, and also used it to evaluate their largest research center. And in Portugal, they used international guidelines, ours, German policy, and also DORA to frame their evaluations. And then in 2019, there was a bit of a fracas in Indonesia. They were criticized. Their scheme they were using to evaluate individual researchers at the national level was criticized for not following the Leiden Manifesto in the principles it was using. And that was covered in Chemical Engineering News and in Science, who called me for a quote, hence I know about it. Universities have also been influenced. They have used the principles to guide the evaluation protocols they develop. We've seen this that we know of, the University of Bath, University of Ghent, Indiana at Bloomington, Loughborough University, and the University of Glasgow. So it's nice to see, or to have these hints, and we probably don't know everything that's happened, but to have these hints that the manifesto is having its intended effects of improving the protocols used to evaluate scientists. Other evidence of effects comes from the 2 big database providers in the area. At the time, the Web of Science was owned by Thomson Reuters, and they came out with this marketing piece in 2016, whose purpose is to tell us how the Web of Science is abiding by the principles of the Leiden Manifesto. So, interestingly, it kind of reflects the status the manifesto has, and then also, by endorsing it, enhances the status the manifesto has. And we didn't know about this. We saw it handed out at a conference we were at, the authors did, and we were like, wait a minute, shouldn't they have asked us? Anyway, and it was kind of humorous. We were particularly giggling over number 8 here, which is avoiding misplaced concreteness and false precision, which you could see in the video. In our minds, that was absolutely targeted at the 3 decimal places, which Thomson Reuters published the impact factor in, and we didn't like that. And what they say here is not, oh, we're going to stop doing that. They say they offer a range of metrics, comprehensive perspectives, and we advise against extrapolating artificial precision to the real world. So in other words, they're still going to keep publishing to 3 decimal places. But, you know, there's other things that they produce under 6, they produce normalized metrics to account for the varying citation patterns. Number 4, keeping the analytical processes open. They say they build the database on strict content selecting criteria, which are, they explain in their notes online, and you know exactly what's in the Web of Science because the list of indexed journals is there. You know, they say they keep the metrics simple and easy to drill down and these sorts of things. So it's kind of nice because, and I know the staff at Thomson Reuters were pleased when this came out because it gave them something to point to in their training. Because the thing about these database providers is they do a lot of training around the world in research evaluation for the customers of their databases. So the people who do that training were very happy to be able to have something like this to point to, for example, try to stop people just relying on the citation numbers to do an evaluation, you know, encouraging them to be a bit more broad and to have those qualitative elements in their evaluation. This year, Elsevier got on board as well. They did a press release this July endorsing the 10 principles and saying that they will strive to develop their research evaluation tools and services to be aligned with the recommendations in the manifesto. They quoted me in that, and they said that they're very interested to have the opportunity to learn from everyone connected with the manifesto and to bring these 10 principles to an even wider audience. And that, I think, for me, that is the real benefit of these companies getting on board like this and endorsing it. It's because they do have a very wide audience of evaluation practice in their clients who subscribe to the database because they want to use it for evaluation. Like I said, these are the people who go out and train those people. So in their press release, they gave this example of Elsevier implementing the manifesto. They said, well, their site score metric, which is their version of the impact factor, it's a journal level measure, is aligned with all these principles. You know, it's clear, so it's aligned with principle 4. It's a suite of 3 journal metrics. It's aligned with principle 9. Principle 9 was actually recognized as systemic effects of assessment indicators, but it may be, we did then say, as is said in the video, that a suite of indicators is preferable, and that may have actually been what we should have used, as it would have been a better principle 9, I think. So they're revising their indicators, as we said in principle 10. Now these guys are only rounding to 1 decimal place, yay, principle 8. So I think we're seeing some good effects of the manifesto. We saw it governments, universities, and the database companies. Very nice, very broad impact. What about the scholarly impact? Well, the paper's been cited 571 times, according to Web of Science, across a range of fields, leading field being information science, of course, the field it came out of, and but also the multidisciplinary sciences down there in the green. That's journals, well, like Nature and Science fall into that category. The paper's been cited 1,300 times in Google Scholar, so very satisfying all around there. You want to get a bit of insight into how people are citing it. I have here something from the very early days This was only published in 2016 from some of the very first papers that were citing it, and but they found, things like papers being cited as a signifier of the broader debate. So that would be cited along with DORA and metrics tied and things like that. It was often connected to being critical of bibliometric indicators. It was cited as an authority proposing best practice, the intent of the paper. It was cited by those critical of the impact factor, presumably along with DORA. It was a reference for other findings, but as I said, we weren't original in our principles, so you could cite something, specific principle that had come from somewhere else, but we stated it clearly in this paper. And you could cite it also to be supportive of bibliometrics in research evaluation. So it's a very flexible way people have found to use it, and it's evolving over time. We looked at the keywords, author keywords of papers that cite the Leiden Manifesto. And in the early year, the keywords, these were papers about the Leiden Manifesto, so that was the keyword they used. Then it broadened out a bit to papers that were overall about citation analysis, the impact factor, science metrics, impact in general, bibliometric analysis. And then in 2018, it broadened again, reached into papers about altmetrics, the H-index, evaluation in general, what was science, bibliometric indicators, journals. And then in 2019, it stepped out wider, even further, not only citations, but also research impact, research policy, higher education, journal rankings, research quality. These are the things the papers we're discussing, that papers that cited to the Leiden Manifesto. So papers always been cited in the Journal of Scientometrics, a core journal for our field. But more recently, papers in research policy seem to be increasingly citing it. So kind of interesting how the focus of the paper citing it has broadened and evolved. What would I say I learned from all this? Well, and I have been asked in the past as to how one can have such an impact. And this experience, I think there's a couple of recommendations I can make based on what I've learned. That things that might be important for impact are, well, first of all, seizing the day. Timing is crucial. When the issue is of broader concern, write about it and publish about it, which is why so many people now are doing exactly that with COVID-19. Would we have had this impact we've had if we'd followed that metric tied report? Maybe not. We were lucky to come in advance of that. Also good if you can publish in Nature. It took a little bit of personal links and things to get it in, although they're certainly grateful they published it. It had like 60,000 downloads in the first year. So those are good figures even for Nature. But the other good thing about Nature is their editing is so high quality. They actually went through 2 editors, and they really edited. They really worked on improving the text. They had a hard limit of 3,000 words, and they really would not let us get away with wiffle waffle and blah, blah, blah. They really tightened it up. Then they said, one of the first things they said to us was you have to use examples. We, of course, submitted our document with the principles and then the rationale behind the principles, and they were like, no, we need examples. And so really improved the engagement of the document by telling our story that little bit differently. Of course, a little bit of a catchy name there, Leiden Manifesto, which came from because our initiative to write the paper arose in a conference that was held in Leiden. It also works because the University of Leiden hosts the premier bibliometric research group in the world. So that's why 3 of the authors are from that university, so it works that way as well. The form of the paper, I think, is also important. Listicle, they've been called, article that's a list. It's kind of a genre of our time. In the recent decade, we've seen a lot of this kind of article in places like BuzzFeed and whatnot. They're addicted to lists. If you look in science policy, grand challenges at its moment, lists, which are lists of 10, 20 important things to do, like the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Lists of things are just somehow fit the mindset and the media at the moment. And of course, doing the video, I think, was important because some people, especially when they're way outside the field, it actually, things that I think are easy to understand, they're like, oh, I understood so much better when I watched the video. And that video cost a couple of $1,000s to produce, so they're not completely out of reach. Cost about as much to do as it does to the fees for publishing an open access paper. And the translations, of course, the translations really, really helpful to get that global impact. And that was a matter of volunteers volunteering because they really cared about the message and getting it out to people in their countries. So with that, I will finish and stop sharing my screen and turn it over to questions.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you, Dr. Hicks. A great overview. And I have to say, I would add a really nice baseline as another way to increase impact. Whoever was playing bass on that video was inspired.
Right.
Was nice. I'm curious. You and your co-authors ended at a nice round number of 10. And I think that you're right. It fits the listicle kind of genre of today. But what was left on the cutting room floor, or what had to be kind of squeezed in from 2 or 3 different points into one to kind of make this 10-point list? What did you end up not using?
Well, I don't really remember things not using. Maybe it was more stretching. Because I remember my Dutch co-authors didn't want to include the locally relevant research, the non-English language research, because in the Netherlands they've had a whole experience with it where research in the Dutch language is just not good research. So they didn't want that in there at all, and I insisted it was in there because I know a lot of people in the world really needed that. So I think maybe it was expanding up to 10 a little bit, more than squishing down. But yeah, it had to be 10. You're right. 8 wouldn't, no, 10, it has to be 10. 3 would also work. 5 would work. 20 is too much. That is what everybody says is wrong with this Sustainable Development Goals. What is there, 26 of those or 17? I don't know. There's something like huge number, and that's always been one of the dings on that effort, that there's just too many of them. Of course, that is another benefit in the development goals provide kind of a lingua franca to talk about that whole area. So the comprehensiveness that they got there is a counterbalance to having so many of the darn things.
Well, we have some questions rolling in, and I know you'll have a lot to say about this one from Caesar. According to your experience, what is your view on the use of altmetrics to support research evaluation? So another opportunity to cite another one of your papers here.
Yes, with another catchy title, which would be The Unbearable Emptiness of Tweeting About Journal Articles, which ironically was highly tweeted. I'm like, people, stop all the tweeting. You're falsifying the argument of the paper. But I did a deep dive in that thing on tweeting about papers in dentistry, because it was on a project it was another stream I was doing on dental research and how it's used, and I dug down into what was being tweeted, and there was just nothing there, or people were just hitting like the retweet button. So I mean, to say most of that indicates any engagement is a great stretch. There was very, very little of it that really did. Strangely, you saw some of the most highly cited papers were highly cited because they were picked up by what I call monomaniacs, which is a self-explanatory word that means people who were obsessed with advocating for a particular issue. In this case, it was paracetamol, its effect in utero, I think it was. And so they were just tweeting and tweeting and retweeting retweets of their tweets, and papers that they picked up on just got tweeted over and over and over and over again by these same people obsessively. So when I started seeing things like that, the vacuousness and then this obsessive tweeting really raising certain papers up, and I do know, like, my paper got highly tweeted because of the great title, that I am not convinced that counting tweets is a great way to look at impact, because certain things get highly tweeted because they're humorous, because it's in the moment, or sometimes because people find a big gaffe in them, but it is very quick, and it takes, like, that is the counter argument, that it takes a couple of years for citations to accumulate, and people don't want to wait that long, and tweets come out in a month or two after a paper comes out, so it does get you a sense of what people are paying attention to in the moment. But people say, well, it talks about the attention from broader society, and I'm not sure it does, because a lot of the tweeting of papers is by other academics, which means, again, you're looking at impact in the scholarly community. So, yeah. Well, I'll just finish on. There's one more thing on that too, because the altmetrics, that matrix is very sparse. So if you have all the papers published by all the different things you can count in altmetrics, because beyond tweets, there's, ResearchGate, things in Mendeley, and downloads and things like that. The data tends to be very thin on the ground. Not many papers are tweeted or dealt with in these other ways in the scheme of things. So that as well limits the usefulness of those metrics.
The next question is about the manifesto itself, and unlike DORA, there's no option to quote-unquote sign the Leiden Manifesto and no quote-unquote credit for organizations that adopt it. Would you consider providing a facility for organizations to publicly sign the Leiden Manifesto as you can with DORA?
Yeah, I've heard that before, but we've never really done anything about it. So that's why we have the more ambiguous situation where I have some information on organizations that have taken it on board and put it out in their own materials. But no, we never were really a sign-on type of thing. So I don't know why. I don't know why we haven't really moved on that, but yeah, I don't know. We just never have.
One question is about what country, or I assume countries, in your observation, are getting research evaluation right or closer to correct?
Well, I think the countries that do it informed by their expertise, if they have homegrown experts in the area, then they do develop sophisticated systems that they apply properly. I mean, Norway's a good example. Flanders in Belgium is a good example of that. I think the Dutch have a very sophisticated system, ironically, because Leiden is there. I think their system is entirely qualitative. Now, the British have put a lot of effort into their system, and it is a model for the world. And it has raised the performance of their science system over the decades, measured in the number of papers that come out. You can see an effect of it. But there's a lot of resources that go into it, and people continually argue with it and about it. So it's difficult to say. So I think it's having the design of the system informed by expertise. And I've been on a few panels advising governments in devising these systems. So people can do it and get it right, but often, I mean, and the governments that do this, I've seen them put a lot of effort into it and really think hard about it. Of course, some of the instances I've been on, then it never happens because the government changes. Things like that also occur. So I'm kind of glad that here in the US, we don't have to have a national evaluation system. We have a more local level with our promotion and tenure processes and things like that. We don't have, a Ministry for Science that hands out money in the same way as other countries, so we don't have to have these top-down evaluation systems that the Europeans, New Zealand, and other countries do. I'm kind of grateful for that.
Just a quick follow-up there. What do you think is the hesitancy to adopt more qualitative metrics to assess research? Is it the constraint of the ability to kind of methodically analyze qualitative research, or the perception that there's an added cost and time requirement?
Yeah, the resources are a very big issue in it. It takes a lot to sit down and work through all the material. If you're going to do it on a national scale, then some of this British system where there's committees are supposed to sit down and work through a lot of materials from like 60 departments. And when push comes to shove, they can't really do it. So under the table, I think they do reach for indicators. But you even see them sneaking into American P&D processes now. Well, because the Google Scholar H-index is so easily to hand. And when you're passing judgment on someone else's work, it's a tough thing to do, and you just so easily want to just point to the number and say, there, look, there's the number, that takes care of it. I don't have to step out in front of the crowd and offer my judgment, and I might be wrong, I might be right, I don't know, let's just use the number. I think there's some of that. It's so easy to abdicate your responsibility to make a judgment and to hand it over to the number because it's off of you, and that responsibility is off of you.
Another question here. The Leiden Manifesto focuses on the use of bibliometrics, but there are other problematic research metrics to which the Leiden Manifesto principles could be applied. Could you envision a version 2 of the manifesto that expands to cover all research metrics?
Well, yeah, wouldn't be a bad idea, although then you'd be getting into the 27 principles problem, because there's always going to be difficulties. Anytime you count anything, anywhere, in any situation, and you apply it for evaluation, there's obviously right ways and wrong ways to do it, and cheaper and more expensive ways to do it. And so it's clear that as the tools evolve, that the best practices need to evolve with them.
This question is about perhaps cultural differences or other structural differences between Europe and the US. How is the dialogue on research evaluation different in Europe than here in the United States?
Yes, it really is different because, as I've said, in the United States, we operate a lot of these processes at the department level. There's annual evaluations, and then there's these strong promotion and tenure evaluations in which individual cases are considered, and people are supposed to read papers and pass judgments, and the metrics are only sneaking in a little bit in the side, although some universities have set up processes to incorporate more systematically metrics into those processes. Indiana Bloomington, one example. But in Europe, because the universities are structured differently in a lot of places, until the past couple of decades, universities were parts of the ministry, and they got 100% of their money from the national government. And there was very little evaluation, to none. There wasn't strong promotion and tenure processes. So the governments, there was a movement to do with what was called new public management. It was happening throughout, really, the public service. Ideas that governments should, instead of doing a top-down Department of the Ministry model, should really have a lot of entities providing services that competed with each other, and you should have strong evaluation on government processes. So this is where these national level research evaluation schemes came into being. So the discussion there is really about these national level schemes, and were they a good idea to set up? And particularly now, people are doing very involved analysis of the effects of the national level schemes on individual level researchers, which is a surprisingly complex thing to determine. A couple of years ago, I thought, well, this would be great. We have kind of a natural experiment where some countries doing these schemes and some countries weren't, and you could then maybe see the difference on the output, the papers and citations from a country between the two, the trends, and you really couldn't. It actually is far more complex, the effects of these schemes, than initially meets the eye, because the national government puts in a scheme, and the universities all respond differently, and within that departments respond differently, and then within a department, individuals respond differently. So it is not a mechanical process, and so you really, to evaluate them, we have to really do a deep dive. And they do find, there's a lot of criticism of these schemes in those countries. Academics aren't stupid. They're like, oh, this is going to destroy science. People won't do novel things anymore. They'll just do quick things they can publish, and it's all going to be so awful. One of the most thorough studies I've seen of the whole system in Denmark did not find a lot or any evidence for all these doomsday scenarios that people had said, but they did find some people completely ignoring the scheme, and other people, ironically, the humanities, generally really following it. So strange things happen, and it varies, but definitely the people in Europe, I think, are more attuned to the impact factor of journals, more attuned to the indicators than perhaps we are here. Although even here, people are now much more, everybody knows what the impact factor is, and you hear it bandied about in conversations much more. So scientometrics and bibliometrics and these measures are really taking much more of a central role in scientists' lives, even in this country.
Well, our next question is something you mentioned during your presentation. You noted that Elsevier endorsed the Leiden Manifesto. Can you address some of the criticisms that recently came up? For example, DORA requires transparency of metrics and open citations, something that Elsevier has refused to do. How could the manifesto make publishers and metric providers more accountable?
Right, yeah, we weren't really at that time pushing on open citations. I think some of the authors are subsequently pushing for open citations. In fact, subsequent to the manifesto being published, the entire editorial board of the Journal of Informatics in this field, which is an Elsevier journal, and Elsevier owns the journal. So the entire editorial board, they wanted the journal to go open access, and Elsevier didn't. So everybody resigned and started their own journal. So that entire set of people went over to MIT Press and started a journal that's owned this time by the Professional Society, EC it's called, in scientometrics, and it's an open access journal, Quantitative Studies of Science. So the people did move on in their advocacy to the open science, open metrics, open citations type of thing, but at that time they weren't that pushing on that. So yeah, so this, I think, is why the database providers adopted and incorporated and put out statements about the manifesto, because we weren't really pushing on them so much. Well, except about this impact factor to 3 decimal places, which they ignored. I mean, there was one principle in there that I was particularly interested in relation to another provider, which was Academic Analytics, which you have in this country. And they were producing numbers, selling them to our provosts, and it was a complete black box where those numbers came from. And when people, like I think Rutgers, they're unionized, I think that when the provost tried to use those numbers, the union got the underlying data on them, analyzed it, and found it was just like completely wrong. So much was missing and misapplied and things like that. So I got that. So the principle in there about openness and transparency, and in the video is about commercial providers should be held to the same standard, was more specifically thinking about that company and how they were operating, because as Elsevier and its products and Web of Science and its products says, and it's right, you can drill down when they do an indicator, you can drill down, you can see what papers are counted in it and what are included and what are excluded. So we weren't really pushing against those guys so much, but there are other operators out there that were trying to sell black boxes.
Our next question is about balance. Quantitative evaluations are easy and not great, but qualitative evaluations can be seen as biased and unfair. And how do we strike a balance between these two approaches?
Well, yeah, that's why we said principle one there, to use them both, right? Because you're right that the qualitative can seem biased and unfair. And so the discipline of doing the metrics helps to ground everybody closer in the reality, right? So if you want to argue, it gives you something you have to argue against. If you want to say, oh, so-and-so is great, and somebody else can say, well, I don't see it in the numbers, why do you think they're so great? So it means that you can't just say, they're not great, believe me, they're not great. Or so-and-so is, and alternatively, I don't like so-and-so. Let's just say they've done nothing. And you're like, wait a minute, the numbers say they've done all this, and a lot of people are paying attention to them. So it is, I think, a matter of balancing, using both. And it's so important not to go completely one way or the other for exactly the reasons you've pointed out, that and people with access to grind or other things can take a judgment way far astray, or if you go all into the numbers, that can miss a lot of important features of a person or institution's record that you really need the judgment to be able to surface and appreciate. So the ideal situation, I think, is indeed when both are used and the metrics are properly constructed, and the evaluators take their job seriously and really delve into the material, and then both of these methods are in dialogue with each other. I think then you're able to come up with a balanced assessment in an area where it's very, very difficult to do that.
Well, Professor Hicks, I don't see any additional questions in the Q&A, and I do feel like that's a perfect note to strike to close the discussion. I do want to thank all of the attendees for coming today. I want to thank Professor Hicks for providing such an important overview of the Leiden Manifesto at a kind of momentous time. We do see the tide starting to turn here in research metrics and research evaluation. I also want to note that this has been recorded, and Professor Hicks has allowed for this to be in the Georgia Tech Institutional Repository, as well as on portions on YouTube. Eventually, we'll be sending out communication about how you can get access to the recording after the session. So thank you again for a wonderful discussion, and thanks to all for attending, and thanks especially to those that provided questions for Dr. Hicks. We really appreciate it.